Welcome again to Inform Kenya, the Nairobi Baptist Civic Education video series. And we are seeking to educate ourselves on how we can play our role as Christians in the upcoming elections, but even beyond. And pretty much to be able to perform our civic duty as Kenyans and as Christians. As we know, we are gearing up for the elections, and there's a lot of things that are happening. And our guest today is Mr. Irungu Houghton, and he's the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya. And we'll be talking about matters human rights. Karibu sana.
Thank you very much. It's great to be on Inform Kenya.
Thank you for making time for us. Give us a brief. What is Amnesty International Kenya about?
So Amnesty International, first of all, is now 61 years old. And many years ago, the founder, Peter Berenson, essentially developed it to protect people who wanted to express themselves freely. And so it was really based around kind of freedom of expression. And then we got more interested in issues of death penalty and lawful killings. But now it's this 70 country strong organization. And many people don't realize, but we're actually a association. We're a movement of individuals, 17 million individuals across the world. Here in Kenya, we formed Amnesty International Kenya, I think publicly, probably in the early 2000s. And a number of people who were then very much part of the second liberation, the struggle for democratic change, came together and decided to form a chapter. That chapter, 10 years later, a decade later in 2012, led to a registration. And we've been working on various issues from sexual offenses to forced evictions to extrajudicial killings to a whole range of the right to education, the right to health, ever since. So the moment I usually say that we are essentially a witness organization. We monitor human rights violations, we interrupt them where we can, and we definitely respond to them in the sense that part of our work essentially is to protect human beings.
In politics, what is the role of Amnesty International?
Well, so we've had for many years a very strong non-partisan kind of impartiality principle. So Amnesty, in different parts of the world, for example, the membership of Amnesty Germany is bigger than any one political party, including the ruling party and some of the coalitions that come together to form the government. So we have more members than the Green Party or former Angela Merkel's party. But we are completely apolitical in the sense that we do not support any political candidates. Here in Kenya, we are very interested in seeing human rights manifestos. We are very interested in seeing leaders that are within the principles and the values of Chapter 6, the leadership integrity chapter in our Constitution. But we are completely neutral when it comes to campaigning for any particular candidate or any particular party. But of course, we have tremendous influence. I mean, we have spent really the last 6 months working on this election, and we can talk a bit more about that. But just to say that we're apolitical, we are non-partisan, but we are vested to make sure that we have good leaders who have human rights agenda for this country.
Manifestos are not the most popular thing in our politics. How do you inform, if at all, how do you inform those?
So actually there's a common sense view that actually Kenyans are not interested in manifestos. But I know there have been a couple of polls recently that show that up to 70% of the population are interested in leaders who have big policy ideas that are able to deal with the issues that really affect the common mwananchi. Issues like, for example, at the moment, who is going to rescue us from this rising cost of inflation, from the cost of fuel, from the cost of food? Who is going to reform the criminal justice system so that we are safer in our homes, but we also don't have rogue police officers essentially executing people because they have no faith in the criminal justice system? How do we make sure that the costs of education come down and we don't have these catastrophic medical bills that you and I and our families are just one illness away from? I mean, it literally, you can wipe out a family's savings in one medical, catastrophe. I mean, heaven forbid, somebody in your family, my family, gets cancer, and they were not insured.
Yeah.
And immediately the family goes into crisis. So Kenyans are interested in those kind of leaders, and I think part of the reason why there was such a slow uptake of voter registration was because they couldn't see leaders who are articulating these issues. But having said that, I think it's important to realize, and I think this is where the cynicism comes with many of the citizens, is that they don't believe that what people say they will deliver on, right? That these are essentially, I guess what you'd say, these are promos without any policy planning behind them. And I think that that's the role of civil society, and that's the role of citizens, which is to make sure that there are plans that are backing these promises.
Okay. You mentioned about citizens being cynics. I read on your website that I don't entertain cynicism well. How do you then address Kenyans in terms of this aspect of cynicism?
I mean, I think we have to see cynicism for what it is, and it is a corrosive force. A friend once said to me, cynicism is like swallowing poison and waiting for the person that you hate most to die before you, right? It is corrosive. It's like that battery that you leave inside a device and not use the device. After a while, when you open up the back, the battery is just oozing with the fluid that is corrosive and actually destroying your device. And if you just touch it, you will find that it corrodes your skin as well. That's cynicism, right? And how it shows up in our body politic is that we have no faith in democracy. We have no faith in democratic institutions. We therefore cannot make a claim or make a demand on those institutions or the leaders that run those institutions. So we allow them, first of all, to tax us at 30% and then go off and do whatever they want to do with the funding. And meanwhile, we continue to complain. Right? And one of the things we know about complaints is that wherever you have a complaint in your life, there's probably no commitment to fixing it. The best sports people, don't spend time talking about the weather, the gravel that they're running on, or the pitches that they're playing on. They are essentially just perfecting their art. Michael Jordan, when he was at his prime, or Eliud Kipchoge, didn't spend hours talking about the surface of the road that he was running on. He just kept perfecting his work to a point that actually didn't matter what road he was running on, because he had adapted. And I think that's the resilience that we need to see in citizens if they want to live a life that is a match for the Constitution.
Okay. In what ways then does Amnesty Kenya come in terms of safeguarding the political interests of the ordinary voter?
No, we essentially we're public defenders. We defend the public. We believe that all human beings have an equal set of rights. We need to be safe. We need to live in an environment of dignity. We need to be respected for who we are. We need to have the freedom of worship. We need to have the freedom of expression and association. And really, that's the only reason that we are here as human beings, is that we have ultimately an opportunity to be free and to be able to contribute to society. And that's Amnesty's view in terms of the world. So it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, whether you are from this ethnic group or that ethnic group. Doesn't matter what your surname is. It doesn't matter age or gender, or a bit more controversial perhaps with the churches, your sexuality. We really believe that everybody needs an opportunity to be free from discrimination and just to enjoy the benefits of being alive. Right? So we do this in many ways. We have research teams that document and do research on human rights violations. We also have campaigners that spend a lot of time thinking about specific issues where, things aren't going the way that we would like it to go. So, for example, on the issue of extrajudicial killings, these are largely deaths in police custody. Last year, there were upwards of about, I think it's 187 people were executed in police custody. That's 20% more than the previous year. So on an issue like that, we've learnt on that issue and on several other issues that actually what you have is an ecosystem of a problem. So it doesn't help to blame. It doesn't help to pass judgment. What's most important is to understand actually what are the different relationships around that issue and how do we move everybody closer to I guess, a position that is respectful of the right to life.
Yes.
And that's the way that we work a lot. So we do a lot of media work. We do a lot of courtroom representation work for victims. In many cases, we do psychosocial support for people. We have a protection unit that helps people to get out of very difficult situations. And as somebody once said to us, we have to be loudmouthed about this, because I often say that, like Al Sharpton once said, I think a year ago during the funeral of George Floyd, and he said, people keep saying, why am I so loudmouthed? He says, I am not paid to keep quiet about human rights violations. That is my role. Because in speaking out, we actually wake up a country. And if a country can wake up and the leadership can take responsibility on an issue like criminal justice reform, all of us can feel a lot safer.
Okay. There was a report a few probably months now from the NCIC about 23 hotspots that have been identified across the country. How does that influence what Amnesty is doing in Kenya?
So we read that report, and personally, I was a bit horrified because that is almost half the country. So we took it very seriously. We analyzed it, and we have chosen as an organization from as far back as November to focus on 5 counties, and that's Kisumu, Nairobi, Nakuru, Uasin Gishu, and Tana River as our contribution to reducing levels of violence. And we've got a 3-pronged kind of work plan for this year. The first is really trying to encourage people to come out and vote based on what's important to them, but to frame it as human rights related issues, and whether it be the right to health, education, or even simply freedom from stigma, discrimination, and violence. The second area of work is really around, actually I should just mention that work is beginning to bubble up now, which is great. So we engaged with about, out of those 5 counties, we've engaged with about 69 wards. And we are now seeing a lot of the people that we trained on these issues beginning to engage gubernatorial candidates. So the first one is coming up fairly soon. It's in Nakuru. The second area of work really has been around kind of police monitoring and police training, so that in those moments when you start to see the intensity of public protests, and just to step back, under the Article 37, all Kenyans have the right to protest. What we don't have the right to do is to destroy property and to hurt each other, right? But expression is a very Kenyan, value under our constitution. So, but of course, in the headiness of the elections, as we saw in 2017, what you had was this very heavy-handed response by police officers, which was either batons flying indiscriminately, or tear gas, or live bullets being used on largely unarmed protesters. So we've started that process and have been involved in a number of different activities. The one that I love most is really the work to bring police commanders and community leaders together in very specific geographical areas, so that when the tension rises, those two collectively, jointly, can de-escalate situations, and really just bring a sense of normalcy back to the body politics. As we know, those type of moments essentially destroy not just the social fabric, and of course many people get hurt, but it is the trigger for an economic depression. So we need to make sure that the economy can recover quickly from these elections. So I think those are the kind of 2 areas. The third one is a new one for us, which is digital rights and digital disinformation. Right? So we are now very carefully monitoring and engaging with the 2 or 3 big social media platforms, whether it be TikTok, WhatsApp, stroke Facebook, and then also Twitter. Because much of the intensity of our political language, much of the hate speech, much of the maliciousness, and just the meanness that you're seeing on these platforms is being driven by platforms that are not accountable to the public in terms of the algorithms that they use. And then secondly also, they are not moderating the content. there is no reason why deep fakes and slander and defamation should be allowed to be, trending on these platforms. So this is the other area of work that we're doing, and it really came back to that work with the NCIC.
Yeah.
We're also working with the NCIC very directly. So in these 5 counties, we will have several community perception surveys every 2 weeks, and we're launching it in a couple of weeks. And those perception surveys will generate early warning and early action work that can be taken by the police service and by the Independent Policing Oversight Authority.
Okay.
So that's our focus for this election.
So in other words, apart from the NCIC and others, you're actually on the ground.
Yeah, very much. I mean, this is the thing I love so much about this election, in the sense that, and I should mention that actually it's the first time Amnesty Kenya has been managing our election response.
Okay.
Right? It seems a bit strange, given, as I mentioned, we've been registered for 10 years, but actually for the last elections, 2017, it was managed primarily by our regional office, which is also based in Nairobi.
Okay.
But I think we're of age now, and we have, again, 2,000 members across the country, 20,000 supporters.
Yeah.
So there's a natural base for this work.
Oh, that's a large workforce.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah,
these are all volunteers I've referred to. The staff profile is about 18. Huh?
Wow.
Yeah, we only have 18 staff.
Okay. Okay.
So the rest is really trying to support ordinary citizens who are just passionate about human rights to be able to do the right thing by training them, supporting them, and if necessary, ensuring that they are protected during this period.
Now, you mentioned Tana River, but left out Mombasa. Yeah. How come? So
we partly, there are a number of human rights organizations already in Mombasa.
Okay.
So Muhuri and Haki Africa, our partners, are very grounded in that particular county.
Okay.
So part of the choice was also to make sure that we don't all crowd
in the same
places.
Okay. Okay.
And the same thing could be said, for example, of the northeastern region as well. Garissa, Isiolo, Wajir, that's a bit.
For someone who's not clued in on the role that Amnesty plays, what are some of the achievements that you've been able to have in the political space that would kind of encourage people that I can go out and vote and I'll be safe, and what my concerns will be catered for? Yeah.
So I guess we measure our impact in terms of 3 areas. The first is I guess how are we impacting on what we call rights holders, people at risk. And during the COVID period, if I take that, the last couple of years, just in terms of an achievement area, one of the things that I think we did relatively well, which was to keep a spotlight on police violence that was happening during the curfew. So the cases of Yasin Moyo, the cases of the Kianjakoma brothers, many of those cases probably would not have come to the light if it had not been for the work of, particularly not Amnesty, but the social justice centers that we support in throughout the country. And these are largely community-based legal aid centers. They run almost on, completely on the fumes of goodwill and voluntarism. So that's one area, I think. And, Yasin Moyo, sadly, we wish it would be otherwise, is a household name now. And many people are watching the court case, which we are supporting in terms of legal legal support for the family. So that's one area. The second one was really around vaccination and the COVID-19, the health pandemic. So many of your viewers probably remember the early days of mandatory quarantine, where essentially if you had COVID, you would be put aside in these very poorly resourced, poorly supervised, we call them detention centers. And we did a couple of studies to demonstrate that actually, first of all, we were behind the curve in terms of how the rest of the world was dealing with COVID-19. But secondly, they were just so badly managed that people would have been safer in their own homes rather than locked up in KMTC and Lenana School and places like that. But then we also shifted and said that the game changer had to be vaccination for all. So universal vaccination was important. But typically in a country like Kenya that has high levels of inequality, where power and privilege is everything, what you started to see was the younger, more wealthier, better connected were fast-tracked for the vaccine rather than the elderly or the people in the urban informal settlements, or the people with comorbidities, you know. So we started generating a conversation around that there needs to be ethical and targeted vaccination while we have limited stocks. And then to some people, we probably gave them whiplash at the end of the year because we ended up challenging the government on mandatory vaccination, because the government then went too far and began to suggest that nobody should, you know, come to church, should have any public services, or be able to travel regardless of whether they were sick or they needed to go to school unless they were vaccinated, which of course now is a violation of the right to choose. And much as an organization, we were very much in favor of vaccination, but it had to be voluntary. So these are some of the examples.
Okay. We already talked about, you know, the social media platforms. What would be the role of an ordinary voter when it comes to what is coming out on social media, in a way, you know, to sort of counter, you know, what you said in terms of misinformation, disinformation, and so on?
That's a great question. I mean, I think there are a number of things. One is, you know, being able to triangulate or to compare sources is really important. Well, actually, let me start the first place. So source verification is the most important thing. So don't just read what's coming at you. Look at who is the source behind it. Is it credible? Is it, you know, is it backed by evidence? And that's the first thing. If it looks sensationalist and dramatic, I often say look at two other sources, right? Don't read, you know, Kenya Kwanza's tweets on Azimio. They're likely to be slightly biased, and vice versa, right? So actually go to the source that you think would have the legitimacy to be able to explain their own story. So authenticity really matters in this moment. The third thing for me is really, you know, to invest a bit of time in this, because it does take a bit of time to remain informed. There is a lot of disinformation out there, but the good news is that 2 years of this now has produced a lot of what we call kind of fact checkers. And there are 4 or 5 organizations, including Africa PESA Check and others, that actually do very quick analysis of fake news. And I think that's one side of it. But I think the other thing, really, my message to citizens, you know, is, you know, about this time, there are a number of people who will be calling me, particularly from the private sector. And the question will often go like this: Irungu, what is going to happen after the elections? And my answer will be the same this year as it was in 2017, as it was in 2013, which is, we will know what will happen in the elections when it happens, right? It really doesn't help us at this point to speculate too much, except perhaps to create some scenarios. But the only reason to create scenarios is not to satisfy some curiosity. It is actually to plan, right? So I often say to citizens is, you know, the road ahead of us is only created by walking on it, right? So if you are primarily a consumer of information rather than a producer of information, then you are already at a disadvantage. So I think getting involved and ensuring that, you know, the people around us, our family members, our communities are essentially informed about the choices that are available to them. I think everybody has their own choice to make in the election. That's the beauty of a ballot box or a ballot paper. But I think really giving people the opportunity to just think a bit more intellectually about, you know, what is the significance of this moment. There's a story I often tell of, you know, I think 96 plus veteran of this republic by the name of Muthoni Likimani, who was actually, you know, lived very close, maybe less than 5 kilometers from where we are today. And she has voted in almost every election, with the exception of one when she was a broadcaster in Europe. And she has said very clearly that if I have to be brought here in a Zimmer frame or in a wheelchair, I will be brought to the ballot to vote. Now my question often is, and I say this to everybody, is that if a 96-year-old plus woman can make this commitment even during a period of the 6th wave of COVID-19, who are you and I to ignore the sacrifices of people like Dedan Kimathi and the Mau Mau and the leadership that brought us this right to vote and stay home? You know, it just is not a match for our history, and it is definitely not a contribution to our future.
True, true. Now, speaking then of choices, what would be your advice to someone who's going to vote in terms of how to figure out what is the best candidate, for my MCA, MP, for the women's rep? What do I look for?
So I think, in 2013, this question would have started with, please recognize the difference between an MCA and a member of parliament. I know we spent a lot of time in that election trying to understand what are the different roles. 2 elections on and 2 administrations on, it's much clearer to us. But I think it's really important for people to just step back and think a bit about, what is the role of a member of a county assembly? It is not to bring roads to your neighborhood or to make sure that the public clinic has drugs. Their role is legislative and policy. And for many of us who, for example, in Nairobi, regardless of whichever of the 85 wards we come from, the fact of the matter is that Kenya has not operated with a master plan or a physical plan in decades. And the shortages of water, the lack of street lighting, the insecurity that we see, all of this is a consequence of a lack of government programming. But have our taxes gone down? No. So my first thing would be is recognize what are these different roles for, and therefore please first of all be sure that you are appointing somebody. And literally, like if you were recruiting a domestic worker to come into your house, or if you were recruiting a house or compound manager, or even an employee, you would take time to study that person. You would study their CV. You would get references. You would look at what they've done in the past. That is even more important when it comes to people who have control over billions of shillings, and let me just be a bit dramatic, all of our lives. So that's the first thing. The second thing really is looking at what kind of policy ideas do they have. And policy ideas for me is not just the slogans that we get now from the top of SUVs. It is really what's the plan behind that. Because one thing that we know is regardless of whoever we elect to come in, they're going to have to deal with a very shrunken fiscal space, whether it is at the county level, whether it is at the national level. Because we essentially have mortgaged the country for a set of debts, for a set of loans that are, yes, producing the roads infrastructure that we can see and the rail infrastructure, but are not actually going to generate the kind of productivity that we need to get the foreign exchange in order to be able to pay back the loans. So we're going into a very lean season, and we need to be clear that the people who come will not take the opportunity to double tax us. I mean, I think that's the biggest challenge. There's a lot of waste in government, as we saw in the last 4 months, where as soon as COVID regulations were lifted, all the MCAs, all the members of parliament got onto planes and went to do benchmarking. Right? We're not even sure, whether they actually got past Jomo Kenyatta airport, but generally they were paid their allowances. So I think these are the things that I would say to people, to really be cautious and careful about this moment, because it doesn't, essentially, it's, voting is 1 day. Governing is 5 years. The amount of damage that the wrong candidate elected into either county or national office can do is dramatic. And we have seen that, very vividly in the case of Nairobi.
Okay. Thank you. Our time is out, but thank you for the great insights and also the challenge to us, because I think ultimately you're telling us, do your homework, don't just tick an empty box for the sake of it. What would be your parting shot?
So I think for the Christian community, inspired always by the example and the legacy of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was not just the Son of God. He was also a refugee. He was a homeless, internally displaced child. That manger was not a home. It was a place that they had gone for refuge. He was also, in many ways, an ordinary person. But perhaps the thing that inspires me most was, in many ways, he was also the probably the most famous victim of an extrajudicial killing. Now, all of those rights violations that are in the story of Jesus Christ are alive and contemporary in the Kenya today. If you are a Christian, if you believe and are inspired by the example of Jesus Christ, then the question we always ask ourselves is, what can you do to reduce the levels of human rights violations from where you are? Many of you, there can only be one executive director of Amnesty International. We only have 18 staff, but we have a population of 47 million Kenyans. If a fraction of you took up human rights defense work, human rights awareness work, whether it be in schools, in clinics, in your workplaces, this country would rise up and be much more dignified and safe for us all. And lastly, I would be remiss not to invite you to become a member of Amnesty International Kenya. So if you go to amnestykenya.org, you can become a member. It's a very simple process. It's fairly painless. You might need M-Pesa, but it is not something that you will remember 1 month after you have registered. So please become a member of Amnesty International Kenya. On our website also we have helplines, and I will make sure that we give this to colleagues so that they can flash it up on the screen. So if you have an issue, an incident that happens during this election season that threatens you, threatens your loved ones, threatens your community, please reach out to us. We will protect you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Irungu. And we will scroll those details, the website and the helpline at the bottom of our screens. And we invite you to join us again in our next edition of Inform Kenya. And in the meantime, keep praying and keep taking your responsibility and your duty, your civic duty, as a Christian and as a Kenyan. Blessings.